Imagine a map of the Pacific Ocean. Find the coast of mainland China. Now look just 110 miles off its shore, a teardrop-shaped island slightly smaller than the Netherlands. This is Taiwan, population 23 million. GDP per capita among the world's highest. And yet, this small island sits at the absolute center of the most significant geopolitical standoff of the 21st century. Every few years, the world holds its breath. China conducts military drills. Us aircraft carriers navigate the Taiwan Strait. Politicians in Washington, D.C. draft emergency legislation. And commentators on every continent ask the same question: is this the moment the world goes to war over Taiwan? But ask a deeper question: why does the United States of America, a superpower with 50 states spread across a continent, care so profoundly about this one island, 7,000 miles away from Washington, D.C.? The official answer involves democracy, freedom, and rule of law, and that answer is not entirely wrong. But it is dramatically incomplete. The real reasons the United States protects Taiwan are rooted in something older, deeper, and far more ruthless than democratic values. They involve semiconductors, geography, credibility, history, and a strategic logic that has nothing to do with the speeches American presidents give at press conferences. The story begins in 1949. The Chinese Civil War ends. Mao Zedong's communist forces have defeated the nationalist government, the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek. The nationalists flee to Taiwan, a large island that had been returned to Chinese administration after Japan's defeat in World War II. They declare Taiwan to be the legitimate government of all of China, and they wait for an American rescue that will come eventually, but never in the form they imagined. At first, the Truman administration was prepared to let Taiwan fall. Secretary of State Dean Acheson essentially wrote it off as a lost cause. But then came Korea. In June 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. Within days, the U.S. intervened militarily. And within days of that decision, President Truman ordered the U.S. 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait, not to protect Taiwan permanently, but to prevent any Chinese military action from destabilizing the broader crisis. It was meant to be temporary. It became permanent. In 1954, the United States and Taiwan signed a mutual defense treaty. In 1972, Nixon visited Beijing, beginning the slow normalization of U.S. and China relations. In 1979, as the U.S. formally recognized the People's Republic of China and derecognized Taiwan, it passed the Taiwan Relations Act, one of the most consequential and deliberately ambiguous pieces of legislation in American history. The act committed the U.S. to providing Taiwan with arms of a defensive nature and to maintaining the capacity to resist any use of force against it, without explicitly promising to go to war on Taiwan's behalf. This calculated vagueness, known as strategic ambiguity, was intentional. It deterred China from attacking by keeping Beijing uncertain whether Washington would intervene, while simultaneously deterring Taiwan from declaring formal independence by keeping Taipei uncertain whether Washington would back it in that scenario. Decades passed under this arrangement. Taiwan democratized. It built a powerful export-driven economy. It developed world-class industries. And quietly, without anyone quite planning it this way, it became so economically and strategically vital to the entire global order that abandoning it became simply unthinkable. The first and perhaps most viscerally important reason is one that most politicians are reluctant to state plainly, because it sounds less noble than talk of democracy and freedom, but which animates the thinking of every serious strategist in Washington: semiconductors. If you have used a smartphone, a laptop, a car, a military aircraft, a hospital monitor, or a home appliance in the last decade, there is an extraordinary chance that its brain, its processor, its logic chip was manufactured in Taiwan. This is not a slight exaggeration. This is one of the most remarkable and consequential economic facts of the modern era. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, known universally as TSMC, is the world's most important factory. It produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, the microchips, that power every meaningful technology on Earth today. Apple's iPhone processors, NVIDIA's artificial intelligence chips that are training the large language models reshaping entire industries. AMD's CPUs, chips embedded in U.S. military systems from fighter jets to precision-guided munitions, processors for autonomous vehicles, for quantum computing research, for satellite communications, all of them designed elsewhere, all of them manufactured in Taiwan. No other company on Earth in any country can match TSMC's combination of scale, precision, and technological leadership at the cutting edge. Not Intel, not Samsung, not any Chinese company. Despite Beijing's frantic efforts over the past decade to build a domestic semiconductor industry capable of competing, the implications of this concentration are staggering. If Taiwan fell under Chinese control, or if a war simply disrupted chip production for 6 months, the global economy would face a crisis unlike anything since the Great Depression. Car manufacturers would halt production within weeks. Consumer electronics would freeze. Data centers would stop expanding. Supply chains for industries most people never think about, medical devices, defense equipment, industrial machinery, would seize up simultaneously. Estimates suggest the global GDP loss from a prolonged Taiwan chip disruption could exceed $1 trillion. And perhaps most critically for American strategic planners, the United States military itself depends on advanced semiconductors for virtually every weapons system it operates. Losing reliable access to those chips, or worse, watching them fall under the control of the principal adversary, would represent a catastrophic degradation of American military capability at the precise moment that capability would be needed most. The U.S. government recognized this explicitly when it passed the CHIPS and Science Act in 2022, investing $52 billion to build domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity, precisely because American leaders had finally accepted, publicly and urgently, that the concentration of chip production in Taiwan was simultaneously the global economy's greatest asset and its most dangerous single point of failure. The second reason is geography, and to understand it, you need to look at a map, really look at it, and trace the chain of islands that stretches from Japan in the north, through Okinawa, Taiwan, the Philippines, and down toward Borneo in the south. U.S. military strategists call this the first island chain. It is not a political boundary. It is a geographic fact, a natural barrier formed by islands, straits, and shallow seas that separates the open Pacific Ocean from the coastal waters of China. Taiwan sits at the absolute center of this chain. It is the keystone. Without Taiwan, the chain has a gap wide enough to drive an entire naval fleet through. If Taiwan is held by a use-allied or use-friendly government, China's Navy and Air Force are largely constrained in their ability to project power into the open Pacific. Every major vessel China wants to send eastward, every submarine, every aircraft carrier, every naval task force, must pass through choke points that are overlooked or controllable from Taiwan. Chinese submarines moving into the deep Pacific waters where they can hide effectively and threaten American carriers must transit through these narrow passages where they are most detectable. Chinese aircraft operating from mainland bases have limited range over the open Pacific, without the forward positioning that Taiwan would provide. This is not abstract. This is the physical reality of military geography, and it is why military planners in Beijing desperately want Taiwan, and why military planners in Washington are desperate to keep it out of Chinese hands. If China controlled Taiwan, its submarines could operate freely in the deep Pacific without the detection risk they face today. Its aircraft could threaten Japan, the U.S. territory of Guam, and the Philippines from positions far more advantageous than any mainland base provides. The U.S. military's ability to project power into Asia, to defend treaty allies like Japan and South Korea, to keep sea lanes open, to maintain the credible threat of intervention that underpins the entire regional security architecture would be fundamentally, perhaps irreversibly, undermined. American military war games have examined this scenario from every angle for decades. The conclusion is consistent. A Chinese takeover of Taiwan would represent such a catastrophic shift in the regional balance of power that it could effectively end American dominance in the Pacific. And without Pacific dominance, American global influence does not merely diminish. It collapses. The United States would be relegated from a global superpower, capable of shaping events on every continent, to a primarily regional power, dominant in the Western Hemisphere, but unable to meaningfully influence the direction of the world's most economically dynamic region. The third reason is the one most rarely spoken aloud in polite company, because it sounds the most coldly cynical, but which serious analysts regard as perhaps the most immediately compelling: credibility. The United States has built the entire post-World War II international order on a foundation of alliances, security guarantees, and promises. Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, and all 32 NATO members, They all operate under a security umbrella extended by American power and American commitment. Their entire foreign policy calculus, their decisions about how much to spend on their own defense, their willingness to align with Washington rather than hedge toward Beijing or Moscow, all of it is based on a fundamental belief that if they face an existential threat, the United States will act. If the United States abandoned Taiwan, if it stood by while China absorbed it by force or coercion, the consequences for every other American alliance would be immediate and severe. Every U.S. ally in Asia would ask, with full justification, if America abandoned Taiwan after decades of implicit commitment, what guarantee do we have? Japan, which faces its own territorial disputes with China and which hosts tens of thousands of American troops, would begin a serious debate about developing independent nuclear weapons, a development that would trigger a cascade of proliferation across the region. South Korea would likely follow. Australia would dramatically accelerate its independent military capacity. The Philippines, already torn between dependence on the U.S. and accommodation of China, would drift toward Beijing. The entire architecture of American alliances, the system that has given the U.S. its extraordinary global reach and influence since 1945, would begin to fracture in ways that no diplomatic effort could fully repair. This logic applies with equal force to adversaries. If China successfully absorbed Taiwan without serious American resistance, what message would that send to Vladimir Putin regarding his ambitions in Eastern Europe and Central Asia? What signal would it transmit to Iran regarding the Middle East? The dominoes of deterrence are deeply interconnected across regions. A superpower that fails to defend a critical partner in one theater does not merely lose influence in that theater. It invites challenges everywhere simultaneously, from every revisionist power that has been watching and waiting and recalculating. This is why, even among American analysts, who are skeptical of Taiwan's intrinsic value in isolation, who might argue in purely transactional terms that the island is not worth a major war, the consensus position remains that the U.S. cannot afford to be seen abandoning it. The cost of the signal, the message that abandonment would send about the reliability of American commitments and the reality of American power, would dwarf any short-term benefit gained from avoiding a confrontation with China. All of this is unfolding against the backdrop of China's extraordinary rise, which has transformed the geopolitical landscape more rapidly than almost any transition in modern history. In 1980, China's GDP was roughly $300 billion. By the mid-2020s, it had surpassed $17 trillion, making it the world's second-largest economy and, by some purchasing power measures, arguably the largest. Its military budget has grown at double-digit rates for the better part of 3 decades. It has built the world's largest navy by number of ships. It has deployed sophisticated anti-ship missile systems, specifically designed to keep U.S. aircraft carriers at a safe distance from Chinese shores, that military planners in Washington regard with genuine concern. It has developed advanced air defense systems, stealth aircraft, hypersonic missiles, and electronic warfare capabilities that have dramatically narrowed the technological gap with the United States that existed a generation ago. And through all of this buildup, the Chinese government under President Xi Jinping has made the reunification of Taiwan not merely a stated objective, but a personal and national obsession. Xi has described it as a task that cannot be passed on from generation to generation, language that carries unmistakable urgency. For the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan is not primarily a strategic asset, though it is certainly that. It is the last wound of what Chinese nationalists call the century of humiliation, the period from the First Opium War in 1839 to the Communist victory in 1949, during which China was repeatedly defeated, carved up, exploited, and humiliated by foreign powers. Recovering Taiwan would, in this narrative, complete China's national restoration and vindicate the Communist Party's claim to be the force that ended Chinese weakness and restored Chinese greatness. U.S. intelligence agencies had assessed that China is developing the military capability to take Taiwan by force by the early 2030s, if not sooner. Whether Xi would actually order such an invasion remains genuinely debated among analysts. The economic costs to China of a war and resulting global sanctions would be enormous. But capability and intent are different things, and the capability is being built with a focus and a pace that leaves no room for complacency. And then there is Taiwan itself, which, in all the great power discussion, is easy to forget is not merely a chess piece but a democracy of 23 million people who have built, over the past 4 decades, one of Asia's most vibrant and successful societies. Polling consistently shows that the overwhelming majority of Taiwanese people do not want unification with mainland China under its current political system. They have a free press, competitive multi-party elections, an independent judiciary, civil liberties, and a standard of living comparable to many Western European nations. They have built all of this from a position of perpetual existential threat, under the shadow of over 1,000 Chinese missiles aimed at their cities, without formal recognition from most of the world's governments, without a seat at the United Nations, and without the security guarantees that most free nations take for granted. Taiwan matters ideologically to the United States because it is a living refutation of one of the Chinese Communist Party's central claims, that democracy is incompatible with Chinese culture, that Chinese society requires strong centralized authoritarian governance to achieve stability and prosperity. Taiwan proves that claim false, quietly and persistently, simply by existing and thriving. That is why Beijing finds Taiwan's continued existence as a democracy so irritating, and why Washington finds it so strategically useful. An island of 23 million free Chinese people, governing themselves successfully, is a more powerful argument against CCP authoritarianism than any American speech or sanction could ever be. So why, in the end, does the United States protect Taiwan? Not for a single reason, but for a convergence of reasons so powerful, so interlocking and so strategically overwhelming that abandoning Taiwan has become, for any serious American strategist, effectively unthinkable. It protects Taiwan because Taiwan manufactures the chips that power the global economy and the American military, and allowing that technological leverage to fall under Chinese control would be an economic and military catastrophe of historic proportions. It protects Taiwan because Taiwan's geography anchors the first island chain, the natural barrier that keeps Chinese military power largely constrained, and losing that geographic advantage would fundamentally and perhaps permanently alter the balance of power across the entire Pacific. It protects Taiwan because America's credibility as an alliance partner, the foundation upon which 80 years of global influence rests, depends on the world believing that American commitments are real and that American power will be used to honor them. And it protects Taiwan because a free, democratic, prosperous Taiwan is the most powerful argument available for the kind of international order, rules-based, pluralistic, open, that the United States has spent generations trying to build and sustain. The Taiwan question is ultimately the defining geopolitical tension of the 21st century, the point at which an established superpower and a rising challenger are most directly, most dangerously, and most consequentially in conflict. Every other issue between Washington and Beijing, trade disputes, technology competition, influence in the global south, climate negotiations, is secondary to this one. History offers sobering lessons about transitions of power between great nations. They have more often than not ended badly. Taiwan is where that danger is most concentrated. It is where miscalculation would be most catastrophic. It is where the world's 2 most powerful nations are closest to the edge. The island endures. The strait remains. And 23 million people live their lives, hold their elections, build their companies, raise their children, and hope, with remarkable resilience and without the luxury of indifference, that the calculations of deterrence will hold, that no general will miscalculate, that no politician will blunder, and that the world's most consequential standoff will resolve itself peacefully, giving them the one thing they have never quite been allowed to take for granted, a future on their own terms.